question. The first recorded instance of a sort of what you could call a steppe nomad group, which I will associate with the domestication of the horse. And this is an important point because these nomads relied on the horse as the sort of primary feature of their lifestyle. They were connected to it. It's what allowed them to be mobile in the first place. It allowed them to herd other animals effectively, which was essential to their livelihood, to their growth, to the sustenance of their population, and so on. And when you look at who they were and how they originated, you can basically trace the domestication of the horse to around 3000 BC in what's now modern-day Ukraine, on that aspect of the Eurasian steppe. And this is where it becomes a kind of grainy area in history. This is not something that's been written down. It's not in recorded history itself, because the group of people who domesticated the horse and engaged in this nomadic lifestyle did not have a written language. And because of this, what we know about them derives primarily from archaeology and genetic studies. Because these people left an impact, they left descendants, and they certainly left a cultural impact that we'll talk about in a moment. But what you see around 3000 BC, this group of people who are generally referred to as the Proto-Indo-Europeans discover horse domestication. And this is probably one of the most revolutionary civilizational developments in human history itself.
Is this all orally transmitted? Like, how do we know about this?
Good question, too. Again, it's not written down because these groups didn't have a written language. Only their descendants would, many millennia later, you could say. We know through archaeology, we see their burials, we see their remains, we see the type of technology they used. We can see how important even the horse was to their culture because they're usually ceremonially buried with it in the same tomb, in the same grave. We see it in genetic studies because these people left a genetic impact as they spread out, conquered different territories, and really left their mark, you could say. And by tracing their genetics, their Y-DNA, their patrilineal lines, you can trace their migration movements. So through this, it's a kind of haphazard patchwork movement. You can trace back and understand who these people were and generally how they spread and the sort of genetic and even cultural impact that they left. One thing that we can see with certainty is the horse gave them a true military advantage. This is also coupled with almost the contemporaneous discovery and use of bronze weaponry and bronze tools. What we seem to think from the archaeological record, this group of Proto-Indo-Europeans almost exploded out of the steppe from where they originated, riding on horseback, wielding a combination, a mixture of stone and new bronze weapons, and they viciously conquered everybody in their path. This is something you see in Neolithic Europe, like the end of the Neolithic period in Europe. There was an entire group of people who had long lived there for about 7 millennia, since about 10,000 BC. They were the first agriculturalists and farmers in Europe. They had small villages, small towns, etc. We see from the genetic record, even the archaeological record as well, this group of people was nearly genocided, completely driven to extinction by these invading Indo-Europeans. And that tells us something interesting about nomadic culture that we may see reemerge in the later epochs. Nomads were absolutely vicious and brutal in a way that settled civilizations struggled to be even when they were sacking cities and destroying the population. They could barely match the scale of nomads who did something like that as a matter of course, just on an average basis. What you see from the genetic record with these Proto-Indo-Europeans is they migrate into Neolithic Europe and they start taking land for themselves and conquering the people who live there. Male lines genetically, that patrilineal Y-DNA line that we can see and trace down, it's passed from father to son in an unbroken chain. The male lines associated with the Neolithic farmers essentially disappear from Europe, completely gone, wiped out, which means you can infer, because it happens at such a scale, it comes from all the burials that they've pulled out from the age and have genetically tested. This group of people, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, came in and viciously slaughtered all of the males that they encountered. Civilizational collapse for the Neolithic farmers. And what makes it also more interesting and perhaps factors into that brutality, we still see a genetic trace from the Neolithic farming females. except you see a combination now of Indo-European patrilineal lines and the Neolithic farmer matrilineal lines, which means they killed the men and took the women. Across the entire continent of Europe. That's extensive. That's a full population replacement and displacement. The last surviving Neolithic males, we see them cluster around archaeologically and genetically in the mountainous regions of Europe. They fled into the mountains to escape the horses, to escape these horse nomads who, of course, excelled on the flat plains and so on and had more difficulties reaching the mountainous terrain. These groups of people had to flee into the mountains and these fortresses as a desperate refuge from the entire extermination of their kind. That's difficult to fathom in the modern world. And I'm going to jump in the timeline and give like a sort of modern example as well. We know the destructiveness of World War II or World War I. We see the millions of lives that are claimed in modern war itself. And of course, when you compare this to the past, there's more people in the modern world. World War II kills about 4% of the world's population, which is a lot. It's millions and millions of people. Yet Germany still exists. They were defeated. The Germans didn't go extinct. The Japanese were conquered and defeated. They did not go extinct. When you're looking at the Bronze Age that we were just talking about, we're talking full-scale population extinction and replacement. That is something at a scale that you can barely comprehend in the modern times. We haven't had a war of conquest and extermination like that since. And we'll see this example in later nomadic cultures, this scale of brutality, this level of destruction in proportion to the population levels, total population levels of their time. It's extensive. You can hardly believe it. Like the famous notable example of Genghis Khan of the Mongol Empire, they estimate he killed around 12% of the world's population. Tamerlane, no, it's crazy. It's unbelievable. And another nomad conqueror who came shortly after Genghis Khan, emerging from Central Asia, conquered the Middle East, Tamerlane, and we know him in the West as Tamerlane. He was known as Timur in his own region. He killed around 9% of the world's population just after Genghis Khan, about a century later. My point with these examples jumping around, going back from the origin, who these horse nomads were in the first place, you see a consistent pattern of unbelievable brutality towards the settled populations that they conquered, the very civilized people that we usually identify with and associate, and that really our civilization derives from. And I wanted to bring this up because it's a really good contrast. You can sort of assess history. This is part of the narrative construction. This is part of our approach to truth. You can assess the history of civilization as this sort of dichotomy between the settled agricultural civilizations, long-term planning, desperately trying to farm and expand. Their civilizations are delicate and carefully calibrated, with these nomadic populations that live brutal, almost eternal lives on the steppe, meaning their lifestyle's eternal. It's consistent for so many years. And they come in every once in a while and absolutely decimate settled civilization. This was a consistent, absolute, almost ubiquitous threat across the entire Eurasian complex. And these settled civilizations had to adapt to that. They had to fortify themselves. They had to develop themselves in contrast to this nomadic reality that was always at their doorstep and threatening them.
What was the relation of the steppe nomads to the ancient Greeks of the Bronze Age?
This is an excellent question, too. If we're talking the Greeks in the Bronze Age, we're looking at Mycenaean Greeks in particular. What's interesting, too, it's a good time to the topic that we were just discussing. These Mycenaean Greeks were the descendants of the Indo-European nomads who had conquered Europe about 2,000 years earlier, or 1,500 to 2,000, somewhere in that time frame. Mycenaean Greek, like most European languages, is an Indo-European language. It's the languages spoken by these conquerors who decimated the Neolithic population. And it's also evokes this sort of meta theme we'll see with other settled civilizations. When these ancestors of the Greek conquer and take this territory, they end up settling down over time. They start adopting the civilizational patterns of the very people they conquered. So when you have the Mycenaean Greeks, for instance, they're about 1,000 years removed from their nomadic heritage, that nomadic lifestyle, that nomadic activity, you could say. But you still see echoes of it in their religion and their culture and their very language, of course, which is that Indo-European language. You see a lot of early Greek mythology centers in Mycenaean Greek, from what we've been able to reconstruct of it centers around horses. It's a very big motif. The very god that they worship, Jupiter, in the Roman terms, but Zeus, like it derives from an Indo-European word for the Sky Father that we've been able to reconstruct from the Indo-European language. So we don't know the full pronunciation for Indo-European, but their chief deity was named Deus, something like that. Zeus, Deus, derives from that. So they have this echo, this remnant of their nomadic past. But what's interesting, they do settle down, they do establish themselves as a sedentary civilization, and later they're threatened by other nomads. Just before the Bronze Age collapse in around the 1200s BC, you have this group that's attested to by the Mycenaean Greeks and later writers called the Dorians, the Dorics, who they identified as horse nomads who had come in from the north beyond Greece and were just fucking them up, basically, just absolutely decimated in the same way. And you saw this, they went from being a nomad-derived population 1,000 years, had settled, adopted those customs, and now we're contending with a new nomadic group that was coming in and supplanting them in the very way that they had supplanted the ones who came before them. It's this recurring pattern, this cycle. In the case of the Mycenaean Greeks, they weren't able to fully resist it either. Their civilization collapsed through a combination of the Doric invasions, according to the Greek sources, other maybe plagues, unrest, invasions of other groups, just a full-scale collapse in the Mediterranean of civilization at that time. But they didn't make it, you could say. They had to readapt over the next few centuries.
And this invasion of the Mycenaean civilization, it wiped out the written record in Greece,
Yes.
right?
It was, the Mycenaean language itself was what was wiped out and lost. And it's because of this broader Bronze Age collapse that occurred in the Mediterranean at that time. And it did get wiped out though. We found their tablets, we see their alphabet and so on. We found 2 different versions of it as well that we've titled Linear A and Linear B. We've been able to decode Linear B, I believe, but not Linear A.
What does it look like?
It doesn't look anything like modern Greek letters, and that's the interesting part. The ability to write, the actual use of this language was lost in Greece for nearly 400 or 500 years after the fact. And when writing was reinvented in Greece, they used an entirely unrelated and new alphabetical system that had nothing in common with the original Mycenaean Greek written language. It just shows that was a terrible civilizational collapse. The very possibility or the teaching of literacy was lost for 500 years and had to be reinvented independently with no continuity. Pretty shocking. And
They got mocked.
They got mocked, yeah. And some of that, in that case, the Bronze Age collapse is a little more complicated. There's more stuff going on, but part of it was nomadic invasions. That was definitely a factor in their civilizational collapse. And this is what you see. I like that question too, because it did bring up one of these sort of trends that you see in nomadic civilizations and why it's important to consider them. They're not just the antagonist. They're not just the enemy who comes in, raises your city, and then leaves. They usually stay. They usually stay for a long time. And at first, they maintain their nomadic way of living, and they extract wealth and resources from the settled populations that they conquered, usually in this sort of one-way vampiric relationship. Eventually, though, in the historical trend has been this, these same nomadic groups, after a certain interval, will settle down and start adopting the culture, the political traditions, the sort of way of life of the very people they've conquered before. Only to, after so many centuries, face another nomadic invasion fresh from the steppe, and the cycle sort of repeats. And I'm talking about this in the abstract very generally, but it is a historical pattern you can look at from 3000 BC all the way to nearly the 1800s. It's very consistent.
Could you talk about it in the context of the Western Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions there?
It's a great approach to it too. So, I'll mention this because there's a broader theory about Western civilization and its relationship to nomads that I think is worth talking about. But when it comes to the fall of the Western Roman Empire around, there's different dates for it, of course. Historians always disagree, but let's say the 5th century, late 5th century, or early 6th century. We're looking at a period of Rome where it nearly didn't survive a serious nomadic incursion that happened with the Huns. The Huns were a classic sort of steppe nomad group, and I mean classic in this sense. We have no idea what ethnicity they were, for instance. We don't even really know what their language was. They were likely a large tribal confederation that extended from Asia into the Caucasus and Europe, and likely had assimilated different groups from all of these regions. Very expansive in that way. There seems to be indications, and this is what the historical record has shown, that they may have been a nomadic group that had been attacking China, the Han Dynasty in China, much earlier, and the Han were able to sort of repel them. And through this, they migrated through the steppe, probably assimilating other tribes along the way, and they were looking for greener pastures, you could say. And they pushed all the way west until they sort of encountered the Roman Empire. When they did this, they were so vicious and violent, like many of these steppe nomad groups were, they had displaced other groups like the Germanic barbarians, who did not live a steppe nomad lifestyle. They were more tribal, lived in forests, different, closer to, they were semi-nomadic occasionally. They did practice agriculture though. They were definitely not a steppe nomad group. When the Huns came in though, they drove them out of their lands thoroughly. This is what caused the vast barbarian migrations into the Western and Eastern Roman empires at that time. Germanics being displaced by this roving Hunnic army. Some Germanic tribes joined the Huns as a sort of survival mechanism, say, hey, this is probably the best bet. If we can't beat you, we'll join you in some sense. And it's interesting, if you look at it this way, you can kind of frame the power of this nomad army in one sense. These Germanic tribes over the next couple decades would be an unbelievable military threat to Rome. They would settle within Rome's borders. Their unity, their warrior prowess would be difficult for Rome to contend with in its sort of weakened state at that point anyways. The Germanics became a sort of warrior class within the late Roman Empire as well. Most of the Roman legions became Germanic auxiliaries who were being hired by the state because they're the most effective fighters at that time. So you can see, and eventually certain Germanic tribes in the collapse, when it's actually happening, are carving out territory of Rome itself for themselves. And the Romans were incapable of stopping them. These are the same Germanics, such a military threat to Rome, who were easily and thoroughly displaced by the Huns. The Huns came in and drove them out like it was no problem. Didn't even bother them in the least, you know? That just shows how difficult the Huns were. And of course, the Romans did fight the Huns. They defeated them in one key battle, but after so many years of just devastation and ravaging, the leader of the Huns this time was Attila. We know very little about him overall, too. It's, again, part of the features of nomadic civilization. They don't have written languages. They're not leaving any documents for themselves. Everything that's written about them is written by their enemies, which is naturally going to sort of create a bias. It's going to cloud the sort of interpretation of what they were. So some of it is shaky, but Attila himself was a vicious conqueror. He took no prisoners.
You mentioned we don't know much about them.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about them? Like, what was Attila the Hun like?
Mm-hmm.
If I was sitting across from him, what did he look like? What were their mannerisms?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe as Pope Leo sat across from Attila, what would he have
Yes.
seen and experienced?
Excellent question. And that's an important historical event to even mention when Pope Leo sits in front of him, and it's a very important encounter. When it comes to his appearance, we have written descriptions of the Romans. Like, he looked interesting. They described him as Oriental or Asiatic in some sense, so likely Asian ethnicity. But there's others that have said that he didn't look like other Asiatic tribes or true Orientals. He might have been mixed in some sense, but this is part of the obscurity. Regardless, I think the important question too is his mannerisms, how he would have appeared, how he would have acted. And somebody like Attila would have typified the conception of a barbarian in the true sense. All of his customs, all of his mannerisms would have appeared brash, aggressive, uncouth, to the Romans, who were very cosmopolitan, settled, civilized, you could say. And this is a consistent theme you won't just see with Attila, but the encounter between any sort of civilized group and we say civilized, it's part of that initial framing I mentioned. We conflate civilization with the settled, urban kind of society. But any sort of civilized group always viewed the nomads as barbarians, people who were rough, people who lived a lifestyle that was so foreign, so just violent by comparison to what you'd see in a sort of settled living, that it seemed like a different race of people altogether. And by this I mean like from almost a different planet or something like that. Their foreignness was so accentuated that often for the civilized people, like in Rome, where they see the destruction that's being wrought by these nomadic groups, they usually see the nomads as something sort of supernatural instrument. They literally will call them the wrath of God or something like that, almost like a demonic force that's pouring over the earth and razing to the ground everything that was. It's really bad. So this is how it would appear. It'd be like looking at somebody who is terrifying, fearsome, aggressive, who you couldn't understand. His whole frame of reference, his lifestyle, his background, his culture, it's something that is, it couldn't be more foreign. It's absolutely separate from anything that you could understand or associate.
What do we know about the social structures of the Huns or other like steppe nomad groups?
This is a great question too. Of course, this is going to vary over time and in different regions as well. But regardless, you surprisingly see a fairly consistent structure. There's going to be regional gradations, cultural change, and so on. But there's a very interesting political conception of legitimacy that many nomadic groups maintained over millennia. They had a sense of themselves as representing not a dynasty per se, not always. For them, like a dynasty, a consistent political rule, a king who passes on his realm to his firstborn son or his descendants, that wasn't their conception totally. For them, rulership and existence could happen outside of that framework. But importantly, something like a dynasty could emerge if the conditions were right. And by this, I mean, this is very general, but if a true steppe warlord comes into being, comes into power, and usually this would be associated or come in tandem with auspicious signs, almost like omens in their sort of shamanistic religious culture as well. You would have the birth of a true steppe conqueror who was given this mandate by their supreme deity to rule the world. And with that, he could take the world by force. And if he really did embody this, he was able to conquer his immediate neighbors. He was able to unify tribes under his command. That would be a sign to other nomads that he really was this Khan, this true ruler. And they would usually acquiesce to his rule and follow him. And with that, they would usually then expand into settled civilizations to establish empires. And if he was a true Khan, he could then have a dynasty. A good comparison is actually the Chinese mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven in the Chinese dynasties through the imperial period is something that a particular dynasty or family will have. It comes from some supreme principle, and it gives them political legitimacy to not only rule as the emperor, but uphold that religious aspect of being emperor too. They're the son of heaven. They have a ritual function in the Chinese civilization. And in the Chinese conception, that mandate of heaven is something that the dynasty has. His children will have it until maybe it's lost for this dynasty and a new dynasty needs to rise up and take it. The point of difference is for the nomads, this mandate isn't always present, and it doesn't just go dynasty to dynasty to dynasty. It doesn't even necessarily happen where a father passes it on to his son singularly. It is something that can emerge in different historical epochs, and when it does, it's usually a total inheritance of the family, and not just the inheritance of a single son or one dynastic line. And it can also disappear and then reemerge in other times too. So what we know about their social customs, they respected strength, and that was an integral part of their political legitimacy. It allowed them to be established as a ruler in the first place. You were somebody who had essentially mastered the steppe. and all of its social, political, and cultural dynamics. And that gave you the right to rule in heaven's name, so to speak. And maybe your family wouldn't keep that right. Maybe your sons wouldn't be capable of maintaining it. And then the empire disintegrates and the nomads return to whatever sort of tribal existence they had before. And that would be okay and expected in their worldview.
So there's obviously this respect for strength.
Mm-hmm.
Were there concepts of moral values in like a Western sense? Or...
It's a good question. It's broad. I would say preemptively I would answer no. Not in this sense. Not in the way that we would understand morality, which you could say, and this would be a gross oversimplification, but it would usually be grounded in some sort of respect for life. There's a sort of right to life, a right to good life, and how we define the good is, of course, going to determine what that means, the different virtues, however we sort of decide to articulate those ethics. They would have not necessarily a morality grounded in sentimentalism, like this is good because it's right and we should do what's good and it's bad to do something wrong. Their morality would be grounded in what was necessary to maintain their lifestyle. So killing, for instance, totally acceptable. You couldn't kill somebody who ruled. You couldn't kill somebody in a particular station. That hierarchy would factor in. But if it was some random shepherd who grazed on your lands, he should be killed. If it's people who live in settled societies and they don't immediately submit to your rule, they should be killed. Because again, if you're a conqueror like that, you have a mandate from heaven to rule the world. So somebody resists that, they become non-human in some sense. They shouldn't even be allowed in the world of that human political order. Is there a morality, a gentleness, a kindness to this? No. Is there a sort of a morality surrounding marriage or sexuality? In a sense. But it's very different from the Western conception. Very male-centered, absolutely, and certainly polygamous. The use of concubines and so on. So radically different conceptions. What you see is actually, this is a broader topic too, through the Middle Ages, you can see the different nomads groups, they adopt various religious traditions from the settled peoples that maybe they had conquered or come into contact with. You see even certain nomadic groups who are Christian. They adopted Nestorian Eastern Christianity as their religion. And yet, they always did it in a very sort of syncretic way, at least at first, where their original traditions, their original practices, their shamanistic beliefs even, never were erased by the religion that they had adopted. They actually just worked in tandem. In fact, they would usually adopt this other religion to enhance their political legitimacy over maybe the people they conquered. But they would be Christian and still practice insane execution ceremonies over entire civilian populations in cities and whatnot. You see later Muslim rulers who were steppe nomads have no compunction about massacring entire Muslim cities because that was politically expedient. It was necessary for the time. They didn't accept their political rule. And would that be in conflict with the morality of the tradition and religion they had accepted? Yes. Did they care? And by this I mean, did it let them stop him? Like, did they get stopped by this in any way? No, not usually.
So let's say I'm a citizen in the Roman Empire. I'm in Gaul or northern Italy, and the Huns take the city that I'm living in.
Yes.
What happens next?
That's a good question too. It depends on what your rulers did before that. Did they accept Hunnic rule and let them come in? If yes, you will just be subjugated to extreme taxation, your property will be seized, and you'll be expected to work and essentially transfer your wealth to the rulers. Any animals you have, your herds, they're going to be requisitioned, they're going to be taken. What happens, and this is like, of course, there's always nuance, there's always going to be certain edge cases or differences, but what happens if your town or city put up a military resistance and refuse to accept that rule? There's a very good chance your skull's gonna be in a big fucking pyramid at the end. Like you're gonna be massacred and killed as a sign to cause terror to all the other cities that this is what happens when you resist our rule. A very famous, we have a lot of sources for it, of course, and it's the most famous nomadic group that everybody knows, but the Mongol Empire, created by Genghis Khan. You see, when the Mongol Empire later starts expanding into the Middle East, the Islamic world as it existed in the late 13th century, or mid 13th century actually, you actually see perfect examples of this dichotomy. The Mongols were famous for giving cities that they encounter an ultimatum. You surrender or you die. We'll give you, if you surrender, you'll be able to keep your religion. You're going to be able to maintain your prices. You're just going to have to pay us a bunch of tax. And we're stealing your wealth, essentially, but you get to live. If you refuse to surrender, we're not just defeating the army in battle. We're not just killing the leaders. We're killing everybody. Every single person you see in this city is going to be dead by the end of it. And a very famous example of this is the Mongol conquest and sack of Baghdad. Baghdad was a very important historic city in the Islamic world, and it was still the seat of the sort of ceremonial head of Islam, the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliph at the time was given this ultimatum. He had less political power than ever. He basically only controlled Baghdad. He did not have a large army, and the Mongols gave him an ultimatum. The leader of the Mongols of this army was Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And he essentially told the Abbasid Caliph, we have the letter preserved, which is really interesting to read. He said, it gives him the surrender or die ultimatum. And he says, if you refuse, there's nowhere in the world you can hide. I will drag you down from the spinning spheres, meaning from heaven itself. I will toss you in the air like a lion. I will leave nobody alive in your city. There will be not a single person left. And sure enough, the Abbasid Caliph, even after seeing this letter, decided to fight the Mongols. And it did not go well for him at all. The Abbasid army was catastrophically defeated. The city of Baghdad was put under siege, and the Mongols did conquer it. And Hulagu Khan was absolutely true to his promise. He massacred essentially everybody in the city. The estimates vary, it comes from various sources, but we're talking 1 to 2, even maybe 3 million people killed over a few days.
Wow.
They had the caliph go into the imperial palace. They dug up the remains of his ancestors, all of their bones in the imperial tombs, and burned them in front of his eyes before killing him too. It's a level of brutality you can barely fathom. And this is what would happen. If you asked the example for Attila the Hun and the Romans, but again, it's part of this broader discussion about the nomads. They're eerily consistent in their violence over history. And if you were any of these groups, if you had resisted their attempts to take over your land, you could be met with a violent and total death for your society, the civilization. So if you're that one individual, there's nothing you can do or say. Your skull is going into the pile. That's it.
Mike, do you know anything about can you walk us through what it would look like, in terms of a battlefront kind of situation? Say the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
You have this huge army going against these nomadic people. What would that look like?
It's a great question too, and it's something I wanted to mention. I keep talking about the nomads, almost like an ancient person would, this fearsome force that's going to come in and destroy society. There's nothing you can do to stop them. In practical terms, it's important to describe why they were like this or why they were effective in this way. Nomads, just based on their lifestyle, they're living on the steppe. They're hunting from horseback with a bow and arrow every single day of their lives. They live on their horses. They're put on there as toddlers. There's accounts of both the Huns and later nomads too, of Hunnic children, for instance, being able to ride a horse before they were taught how to walk. This would be more essential for them. This is their lifestyle. They're herding animals, shooting the bow every single day. Part of the reason they were so effective, in their society, every male was a warrior. Every single male could be marshaled up into the invading force of their marshaled military force. There wasn't a single person, a single male, by the time he was a teenager, all the way to his 40s or 50s until he couldn't ride anymore, who couldn't be utilized in the army. Second of all, their lifestyle translates 1-to-1 into warfare. They're shooting the bow from horseback, chasing their game every single day. And this is the exact same thing that they're going to be doing when they're in battle. Instead of chasing a deer on horseback and hitting a perfect shot from the bow, they're shooting a guy who's standing still in a big military formation. It's way easier, actually, in a certain sense. And this is what made them so difficult. They were fast, mobile, masters on horseback. And if you're fighting a civilization like even Rome, you may be dealing with levies. And by this I mean non-professional soldiers. You'll have professional Roman legions, of course, but what are they going to do against a group of horse nomads who ride up real quick, pelt them with arrows, and ride off before you can retaliate? You bunker down, you shelter down, you can't chase them. Your horsemen aren't as fast. They're better. They're going to hit you as you're trying to ride after them. They're going to hit you if you're stationary. What do you do? And the answer was usually nothing. That was the worst part. There was nothing you could do. There was different strategies that developed over time to counter the nomads. And many of the strategies involve just almost becoming the nomad yourself, just mirroring their tactics, creating light horsemen or perfecting horse archery in the same way that they had as best you could. But if you're a settled civilization too, and you have the levies, they're non-professional soldiers. They might just be regular farmers that have been called up. They farm most of the time. They're not trained. They don't have any combat experience. They're marshaled up for a few months campaign, and they're going against these nomads who live a lifestyle that have skills, basically, that translate one-to-one to warfare. They're going to be able to just annihilate you on the battlefield. You're a levy with no armor given a spear or something. There's nothing you're going to be able to do against a highly trained, highly organized, effective nomad army that's going to literally ride circles around you and pelt you with arrows. That's all it is.
What about going against the sieges of cities? Like, when you're talking about like the Abbasids or like the Romans who had superior technology and like fortifications, how did the nomads overcome that?
It's a great question too. Usually that was their big obstacle. It's correctly identified. They're mobile. They're not maintaining large siege weapons, whether it's catapults or trebuchets later or whatnot, not at first at least. What they relied on initially was basically destroying the countryside and just starving out the city. Like you would go and just raid everything else, just raze it to the ground, destroy all the farmland, and you could just do that and just be a menace in the countryside. Eventually, people are going to starve the city. And when they do, they come out and ask for surrender. That's when you kill them and take it over. That's an oversimplification, but in principle, that's essentially what worked. It was actually the Mongols who most effectively incorporated siege warfare into their campaigns. They basically adopted siege engines from China, from Europe as well, and the Middle East, and became very effective in their use and employment. They'd be able to disassemble them, reassemble them really quickly as part of their mobile camps, lay siege to a city like any other army would be able to. It was something that they mastered, and when that happened, it was kind of over for like Asia and the Middle East. As soon as they were able to conquer cities effectively, man, they really are unstoppable. Your walls don't mean anything anymore, you know. It'd be pretty gnarly. It'd be bad. But to answer the question directly, at first it'd just be raising the countryside, starving them out, because they can exist forever outside. You know, they need just grasslands and they're fine. The regular settled civilizations, they need to plant the harvest, they need to cultivate it. That's it. Eventually they'll starve if that's not possible. Later, the Mongols set the pattern. They learned really how to incorporate siege warfare into their military package, I suppose you could say. And then cities are no problem for them.
So what caused like the downfall of like the steppe nomad tribes or civilizations? Did they fall?
They did. And it's actually, and this might be a slightly controversial claim, but I would actually situate it at the invention of the machine gun. That's how recently I'd put it. And if you think about it, this is the invention of the machine gun, real rapid fire gunpowder weaponry. That's also marks the end of like the effectiveness of just general cavalry and warfare, even in European armies. Like when World War I happens, for instance, because of the machine gun, cavalry regiments are much less effective. They tried to use them at first. They were just cut down by the machine gun itself. This would be the death blow to nomad groups as well, more or less. Even before that, if you go back to the 1500s, the 1600s, we have like well-established musket warfare. Even well-trained musketmen weren't enough to stop nomadic armies. It's actually an important point. This is something I want to say about this sort of meta-narrative, the progression of Western civilization. But it's an important point that the Ottomans, for instance, who fought in World War I and were actually fairly successful, all things considered, even defeated the British military in the Battle of Gallipoli, they still, all the way through the 1800s, maintained light cavalry archer regiments to deal with steppe nomads who might be raiding from the Crimea and whatnot. The Russian Empire, at that same time in the 1800s, the core of their army, one of their most renowned regiments, were the Cossacks, who were just Russian nomads, basically, who had adopted the nomadic lifestyle, lived on horseback to counter the Tatar tribes who raided the countryside and everything else to help subdue them. All of these countries that were in contact with nomads all the way into the 19th century, just before the invention of the machine gun, still had to use nomadic tactics to deal with nomads themselves. Regular guns weren't enough to stop them. You needed a machine gun. So their hegemony, you could say, is broken in the 20th century, late 19th century. That's when they stopped being a real military threat, you could say. But that's pretty shocking. That's a long time where they were still persistent. They just weren't persistent for Western civilization during that period. That's a big difference.
So they mostly affected the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire?
At that time, like the 19th century, for sure. But the Ottomans themselves were descended from steppe nomads much earlier. Like they had gone through this exact pattern. They were nomadic conquerors who conquered and settled and eventually ruled a sort of imperial settled state and then had to deal with nomads themselves. The Russians, they had a city-state before this called Muscovy, but it had almost emerged in response to the Mongol conquest because the Mongols had conquered Russia, or what's now Russia at that time. And the Russians had to sort of assert their independence against a nomadic force and use semi-nomadic tactics to even do so in the first place. Across the Middle East, all the major polities at the time were nomad descended in some way too. Like you didn't see maybe the same persistent threat all the time from the steppe, but you were certainly living in the legacy of the steppe, even by the 19th century. Most of the dominant powers, look at China, even the Qing dynasty in the same time, 19th century, and they'd been ruling since the 1600s. They were descended from nomads, effectively. They were Jurchen nomads, or Manchu nomads, rather, which are Jurchens, I think. I might be wrong. But regardless, they were nomads who conquered the Chinese state as well, took it over from the Ming. Outside of Europe, the rest of the Eurasian complex was essentially ruled by nomadic polities. Even India itself, before the British fully conquered it, was ruled by the Mughal Empire, which were descendants of Tamerlane. And Mughal is the sort of Persian word for Mongol. That's literally what it means. They were distant Mongol descendants and had lived a nomadic lifestyle themselves. Anywhere you looked in the world in the 18th, 19th century, outside of Western Europe, it was still nomad dominated or dominated by the descendants of the nomads. That was the whole political structure. That's
So
why
was Western Europe untouched by this?
It's a good question too. I keep saying that for every question, but they actually are good questions. It really does help center it. It does frame it. Western Europe, we had a couple buffer zones, you could say. Truly. In the first place, it depends on which period you look at. But let's take the Middle Ages, roughly. The one really bad nomadic incursion was the Huns. It essentially led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. That sucked. It was really bad. It took a lot of rebuilding. But from then, the Byzantine Empire in the East, which was Eastern Rome, the inheritors, a successor to Rome, truly the true successor to Rome, you could say. Through the Middle Ages, the early and high Middle Ages, they dealt with nomads all the time. And they were basically this bulwark and buffer state against nomads. The main imperial province for the Byzantines was what's called Anatolia, or Asia Minor. It's the modern-day state of Turkey. In the 1000s, around 1073, I believe, I'm probably getting the year wrong, almost the entirety of Anatolia was conquered by a group of nomads called the Seljuk Turks. They'd established, these Seljuk Turks had conquered all of Persia, all of what's now Iraq and Syria as well. They'd converted to Islam, and they were now ruling over these territories as like semi-nomadic, semi-settled conquerors. And they expanded into Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert, which I think was 1073, but I'm probably wrong. They just decimated a Byzantine army and it opened the gateways to just flood Anatolia. And they did. They totally took it over. And this is what caused the Byzantine emperor to essentially panic. And he said, we need help from the West, from the Latins, who at this time, the schism had happened. It was not looking too good. The relations between East and West were not good. And yet the emperor appealed to the West. And this is the start of the First Crusade. He wanted the Western Latins to come in, help retake the Holy Land, which was now controlled by the Seljuk Turks, and ultimately help the Byzantines retake Anatolia eventually as well. The fact that these nomads had come in and taken over this massive swath of territory from the Byzantines was actually the catalyst for the First Crusade in that place. And it was good. Western Europe didn't have to deal with it. The Byzantines were a bulwark. When the Bulgars came in too, the ancestors of modern day Bulgarians, they went and fucking attacked the Byzantines. We didn't have to deal with it in the West. That was awesome. It was really good. Later on with the Mongols, effectively Russia becomes the bulwark too. They're dealing with the Tatar tribes. They're preventing this expansion further west. There's another factor too, and you do see it with the Mongol conquest. Even though we mentioned they'd incorporated siege warfare into their sort of military repertoire, Western Europe still would have been really difficult for them to conquer. And it just came from the sort of pattern of medieval civilization, which heavily emphasized castle and fortress building. That was just part of the political order. Every noble effectively had a castle, and there was a lot of nobles across Western Europe. The Mongols did attack modern-day Hungary and the Hungarian kingdom at the time. And they were successful a bit at first and eventually got pushed back by the Hungarians because there were so many castles to conquer. It was really difficult for them to muster all the siege engines and keep going. And you can imagine that would likely be an obstacle for nomad armies coming in during the Middle Ages as well. But really my answer would be, we just had other states in the way that were dealing with the problem. And it really messed up those states. The Russians, going into the modern period, they become known as the sort of the semi-barbarian Asiatic Europeans. Like they look too nomadic in a certain sense, even though it's not the Slavs, but it's all the other groups that are kind of loosely under their dominion. And they're also not industrialized to the same scale because they can't be. They're dealing with a different type of persistent threat. When it comes to the Byzantines, they fully collapsed to nomadic armies, and at least the successors to nomadic armies too. This is the start of the Ottoman Empire, which then they're not nomadic any longer, but they continue to threaten the West for the next 200 years, from 1453 through the Ottoman Golden Age of the 17th century. It's pretty bad. But these buffer states were a big deal. It really prevented the nomad threat from just pouring over into Western Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. Again, it's persistent. It's this contrast between the settled civilizational type, and we always see it if we've even used the language a bit here as we describe the nomads, the barbarians. They would have been rough, coarse, uncouth, and so on. Maybe instruments of the divine, the supernatural, instruments of wrath usually, which ties into their martial nature, you could say. But they weren't just coming in and destroying civilization and leaving. They embedded themselves in civilization. They took it over. They ruled it. And in their own way, they brought their sort of step habits, their nomadic rule, and incorporated it into what would be the settled civilizations as they recovered and developed after the nomadic incursions themselves. It's happened almost every time. It's this very interesting dance and interplay, this synthesis between the conquerors sort of adopting the customs of the conquered and becoming them, but also bringing their own heritage into it.
Do you think that this buffer for Western Europe is part of the reason the West industrialized and developed so far ahead of the Ottomans, the Russian Empire?
This is my particular historical claim, I could say, and there's likely real historians who've made it before as well, but I think the answer to that is yes, ultimately. And this is that meta point I've alluded to a few times, but I think Western civilization was geographically lucky in a certain sense, where it could be isolated from the constant threat of nomadic incursions. I mean, to put it in contrast, we had buffer states in the way, so we didn't have to think about it. If you look at the Chinese, for example, they built a massive wall across the continent just to keep the nomads out. They did channel all their civilizational efforts just to keep them out. We didn't have to think about it. And that allows for a different type of military tradition to develop too. You don't have to structure your civilization around the constant threat of nomadic incursion like the Chinese did, like the Middle Eastern empires and so on. You have to think about your immediate neighbors. You're dealing with your political rivals, and this is how the political relationships will always emerge. It's proximity. It's who you're closest to. That's who you're going to fight for land and resources, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're dealing with a similar civilizational complex, similar cultures, and so on, using the same general military technology, and there isn't this nomadic threat, then it can develop in a truly different direction. I would say, and this is how you sort of get to industrialization maybe down the road as well, but starting from the 1400s or 1500s, Western Europeans can put a greater emphasis on the development of gunpowder technology compared to comparable states in the Middle East or even Asia. A good example of this, to really show this in one sense, the first kind of country or kingdom, whatever you want to call it, to use gunpowder and cannons, for instance, in siege warfare was actually the Ottoman Empire. And they used it to conquer the Byzantines, as I sort of just mentioned. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 is the first use of real cannons to break the Theodosian walls and end the Byzantine Empire, take the city. The Ottomans were also the first state to have a centralized professional musketman corps, a real musketman force, to incorporate gunpowder technology as the core of their empire, even before the Western Europeans did. And yet, over time, and fairly shortly after, you start to see technological imbalance. Europeans develop gunpowder technology and improve upon it to a greater degree. Why? Because it's necessary for sieges. The same thing that kept maybe the Mongols out, all of these fortresses and castles and so on. Well, those are the very things that need to be destroyed by cannons, you know? If you can build bigger, better cannons, more effective muskets, that's the type of warfare structure that's going to exist in Western Europe. You don't need to have a cavalry regiment of horse archers to try and fight off nomad raiders who are going to pour over the steppe. You can just focus on siege warfare, better and bigger guns. The Ottomans, who started with the technology, they maintained gunpowder regiments, of course, but there's less of an incentive to improve on it. Because really, as I sort of said, until the invention of the machine gun, guns aren't enough to stop nomads. And you're not going to invent the machine gun unless you're really emphasizing the particular development of gunpowder technology. That's it. So this gave Western Europe a unique advantage. It could sort of develop in isolation in its own way, especially its military technology. What do you need to produce more guns? Better industry, manufacturing. What do you need to improve upon this technology? Better processes for the manufacturing. I don't think it's any coincidence to tie it into industrialization, particularly that Eli Whitney invented interchangeable parts, which would be essential for the Industrial Revolution, using a musket. That was his whole demonstration. That was the very thing. He said, look how quickly we can build muskets with these interchangeable parts. This would greatly enhance our manufacturing. But there was a certain emphasis there that you just couldn't make, and this would be my claim, you couldn't have elsewhere. Because you needed to improve upon your archery tactics, your riding, less on the gunpowder, because it was just not effective in dealing with the immediate military threat in your region.
What are the other big points that this overlooked area of history you think we should take away from?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question too. It's this part of the contrast. We've gone into a lot of the details and sort of described the nomads themselves. Why I want to bring up the contrast in the first place is because it's the perfect setting to establish the synthesis, to show the way that the nomadic world has influenced other civilizations and even our world in some sense. But really what comes with that, and a sort of and this is the important part, but it's the sort of mindset that was necessary for nomadic existence. With the breaking up of the nomadic hegemony, you could say, that mindset's effectively lost. The nomadic world's gone rapidly extinct. There's only small holdouts. And there's more to say about the mindset, you could say, but it's even like to pinpoint it, like a religious example. The way the nomads view the world and religion was very much different than the way settled civilizations did. You can even see, it's a maybe tired historical narrative in its own right, this clash of civilizations narrative between, like for the Crusades, for instance, it'll be Christianity versus Islam or something. These are two creeds, two established traditions and religions that are incommensurate, that can't be reconciled. And if there's a real territorial dispute or whatever, then there needs to be fighting. You need to fight it out over it. They can't be reconciled. With the nomads, their view of religion, for instance, was far more fluid. They viewed the world and religious tradition itself as less absolute. It was less fixed. In the same way that a city would be fixed, it's maybe fixed in the mentality of the settled peoples themselves. For the nomad, religion represented truth, but not fixed truth per se. And it could be reconciled with all of the other fluid truths that they encountered, which were all speaking to a similar or even identical higher reality. It's an interesting thing. It's always an example that's given the Mongols. They had this great degree of religious tolerance. They let all of these different peoples practice their religions even after they'd been conquered. But Genghis Khan himself was fascinated by other religious traditions outside of his own. And he would requisition and bring in scholars from Islam, Taoism, Christianity, Buddhism into his court and have them teach him. And he never adopted a single creed from either one. They would host debates even between the different creeds, and they would kind of decide who runs, but would be like, okay, this is interesting all around in a certain sense. And even later, when they did convert, they usually still maintained their religious practices from before, the shamanism, the worship of Tengri, practice of astrology, divination, like looking for omens or symbols or signs of the future and so on, while still practicing their established religion. These things wouldn't be in conflict. You see this in the Islamic world after the Mongols had conquered it. Later, Mongol descendants became Muslim, and then even other nomadic empires after the fact. They practiced Islam, but there was a huge resurgence of like Sufi mysticism, occult practices, astrology, these sort of things that just were present to some degree, but now it has experienced a renaissance within this post-Mongol world. And that mentality, there's a sort of fluid, a movement in truth of the religion, seeing the world as almost so many different sonorous expressions of the truth. These are all like different religious rhythms and religious harmonies that can be incorporated and harmonized and centralized in the true rulership and the proper political order. That's interesting. It's a totally different conception than what you see in settled civilization. And that's what I mean. What's lost, what's gone, what's the broader point of bringing it up? You can see how the nomads have influenced the development of our civilization. You can see how it's influenced our development. You can see how it's contrasted with ours. But you can also see what's been lost. To tie it in to sort of the opening, historians usually look at what's written down, and that usually comes from the settled civilizations themselves. There's an entire human type which has been enormously consequential for our history and our development that is now essentially lost and gone extinct. And there's only general efforts, you could say, to reconstruct that. And it's usually done through this sort of framing through the lens of the civilized, settled peoples. Look at these, they're primitive, they lived a different way of life. I'd say no, it's important to look at the nomads as they were and appreciate them for what they were and sort of understand how they contributed to our civilization. It's important. It's something that could be lost just like they were lost.